So I want you to think about your body kind of like a house. And the hunger regulation, that is going to be considered your thermostat. This ultimately is what maintains the right temperature, so your energy balance. And I mean, this is, of course, with a heavy asterisk, like ultimately you can be very dysregulated in terms of hunger signaling. And if you don't put food in your mouth, like you won't gain weight. Vice versa, you can be very muted, very low degree of ghrelin and high degree of leptin, which I'll explain how those play a role into this soon. You can have very low hunger signaling, and the fact is you can still gain weight because you were eating enough to put yourself into a surplus. But these two key hormones, ghrelin and leptin, they are going to act like the sensors that are constantly monitoring and adjusting to keep you comfortable. You have to remember that your body at all times, it is trying to keep you safe. It is trying to keep you in a state where there are no threats, including intrinsic stress and intrinsic threats, which would be starvation. So ghrelin, this is like a sensor that detects when the temperature, the energy levels are too low. So it tells your brain it's cold. Turn up the heat. In other words, we need to get food. So leptin is the sensor that detects when the temperature is too high. So it signals essentially we're warm enough, turn the heat off, we've got enough energy, or in this case, food, you can stop eating. Now together, this is what allows you to maintain this energy climate. And in healthy individuals, these regulations should be pretty balanced, ensuring that you neither overheat or overeat or freeze, which in this case would be starve. Now, why does the thermostat malfunction? Like any faulty thermostat, external factors can disrupt this system. Now, the big ones are going to be dieting and fasting. Dieting or fasting, they can lower the temperature, causing ghrelin to kick into overdrive and scream for food. Now, at the same time, leptin, which should calm things down, begins to whisper or lose that sensitivity, kind of like a sensor ignoring warmth. It makes it harder to feel satisfied. Now, other influences would be stress, poor sleep, or unbalanced meals. It can then confuse the thermostat, leaving you feeling hungry even when you've had enough or never quite satisfied with no matter how much you eat. Also the case, I'm going to throw this in there, dehydration. Dehydration is very skewing. That can skew hunger signaling heavily. We're going to get into that today. Now, if we circle back to ghrelin, this is the hunger hormone. It's your body's appetite starter. It's produced in the stomach and small intestine, and it works by binding to specific receptors in the hypothalamus, the brain's hunger control center. Now, think of it as the hormone that flips the hungry switch on or off in your brain. So what increases ghrelin? We've got easy ones: fasting, skipping meals, low calorie diets, because now your body is trying to compensate for this perceived energy deficit, as well as circadian rhythms. So circadian rhythms, your sleep-wake cycle, this can also heavily influence ghrelin levels because these levels naturally rise before meals. Now, what decreases ghrelin? Eating especially meals rich in carbohydrates. This temporarily suppresses ghrelin. Now, high body fat stores reduce ghrelin as part of a negative feedback mechanism. But really, when we look at the hormone that is largely going to be tied to the production of body fat and the amount of body fat readily available, that's actually going to be leptin. So leptin is like the brake pedal for appetite. It's produced by fat cells and tells your body when your energy stores are sufficient. Now, this is especially problematic for the physique competitor, especially if you already have dysregulated hunger signaling, because in the state of contest prep, you could at some times be losing 12, 15, 20% of your total body mass. And in this case, like, you're probably losing mostly fat. So where do you think that leptin is going to come from? Well, there's systematically less body fat that can then produce leptin, meaning that you're not going to be getting that tap, that cueing, that physiological cueing to signal that you are satiated. Now, increased leptin, so increased satiation, increased fat mass is the easiest one. Leptin production is proportional to the amount of fat stored in your body, as well as carbohydrate and insulin stimulation. So insulin actually promotes leptin secretion after meals. Now, when we look at the things that decrease leptin, this is going to be simple: weight loss, fat loss, like significant bouts of either of these, fasting, so even acute fasting, and prolonged caloric restriction. These can all lower leptin levels, making it harder to sustain that deficit over time, because now you're not getting that nudge, even though you may have eaten a specific amount of food. And in other words, like at a higher body fat, it would be very satiating and you would feel satisfied. But the leaner you get and the longer that you spend in a deficit, the harder it's going to be for you to continue to get that same signal. So there's a landmark study by Rosenbaum in the 90s showing that after weight loss, leptin levels dropped significantly, like up to 50%, even when body fat decreased modestly. Now, this drop was correlated with increased hunger, so increased ghrelin, reduced energy expenditure, and a greater drive to eat. Now, this is why I'm someone who's like, if you're going to be in a fat loss phase, we need to make sure you are actually losing fat. Like, I don't want to do this passive kind of modality where we just dip our toe into fat loss and just assume that it's coming off, because ultimately you are perceiving that you're in a fat loss phase and that dietary fatigue is going to accrue, even if you're losing very slowly. This becomes problematic when you're not actually losing fat at an adequate rate. And if your goal is to lose 10, 15 pounds, yet it's taking you 6, 8, 9 months to do so, this is ultimately going to come with some kind of reverb on the way out of that diet that ultimately we would rather avoid. Now let's look closer at dietary composition. So why is it that carbs suppress ghrelin more effectively than fats? Well, carbohydrates stimulate insulin, which enhances post-meal ghrelin suppression. So it suppresses that hunger. Fat, in contrast, has a weaker impact on insulin and doesn't trigger the same response. Protein does suppress ghrelin more effectively and for a longer duration because it's harder to digest, meaning it actually slows down digestion, which can be a nice little hack if you're someone who does find that ghrelin is something that is elevated higher past the point than what you can adequately consume while in a fat loss phase. Now, why does leptin respond to carbs? Now, insulin and leptin are closely connected. When you eat carbs, insulin spikes. This signals to fat cells to secrete leptin, which then communicates satiety. Now, fat alone, consuming fats, doesn't produce this robust insulin leptin feedback loop. You also have to consider how the perception of eating fats are 9 calories per gram, whereas carbs and protein are 4 calories per gram. This was something that for the longest time, and just from a budgetary standpoint, calorically, fiscally responsible, I'm like, I can't get as much fat, as much volume. And if I know that I want to eat a higher volume meal, it's going to be harder for me to justify eating fats because that's going to inadvertently reduce the amount that I'm going to eat. Now, when we look at the systematic pattern of these rises in ghrelin, why is it that ghrelin levels rise before a meal? So your body actually learns these patterns. And if you consistently eat at noon, ghrelin starts to rise shortly before that, preparing your body for food intake. Now, this is a conditioned response, very similar to Pavlov's dog salivating at the sound of a bell. Now, in the case that you're skipping meals, this conditioning doesn't just modify according to your schedule change. Skipping meals also disrupts this learned ghrelin cycle. So this is going to in turn cause erratic spikes that can then lead to overconsuming later, which is why I'd always say if you have the ability to have a very small snack with you, even if it's an apple, a protein shake, a yogurt, this can put some of that spike at bay or at least reduce it to some extent.